The Wolf Among Us has one of the most cursed development histories of any game. From announcements to cancellations, rebuilds, and more, now Telltale is saying that Bigby Wolf is finally returning in 2027. The original Wolf Among Us released its 5th and final episode in July of 2014, and Telltale knew that people wanted another season. And even though the studio wanted to give the fans that next season, they just couldn't because they had a ridiculous number of projects that they were digging themselves into. Tales from the Borderlands, Game of Thrones, Minecraft Story Mode, and even more licenses coming to join the Telltale schedule. Wolf 2 was something that the company wanted to revisit for some time, except they didn't have time, and their solution to not having time was apparently to keep signing up for more work. So after 3 years of questions about where has Bigby Wolf gone, Telltale finally announced The Wolf Among Us Season 2 at San Diego Comic-Con in July of 2017, and the new season was targeting a 2018 release. But wouldn't you know it, the wait was going to get much worse. Internal changes at Telltale pushed the sequel from 2018 to 2019, but it never even made it that far. On September 21, 2018, the studio announced a majority studio closure after a year of what it called insurmountable challenges. Roughly 90% of the workforce was dismissed, while only 25 employees remained temporarily to fulfill existing obligations. But with these changes happening at the company, both The Wolf Among Us 2 and the other game that they were going to give us, Telltale's Stranger Things, they were cancelled. The original Telltale company was effectively dead. Former employees later revealed that the first version of Wolf 2 had barely even made it off the starting line. It was operating on a budget that was really small even by Telltale standards. The planned season at one point had also been cut from 5 episodes to 3. And I don't know about you, but I want 5 episodes. If you give me 3 episodes, I'm gonna feel slighted. And although the season overview had most of its first episode script reportedly complete, the game itself consisted largely of concept art and early gameplay prototypes. So after The Walking Dead became a phenomenon, Telltale decided they would keep expanding rapidly and keep stacking one major license on top of another without giving the rest of the company, its employees, room to catch up. It's starting to sound a lot like Mappa with JJK. The developers were always in a constant crunch, 14 to 18-hour workdays, rewrites, reanimations, everything was always on fire. The episodic model that Telltale was operating on, which they had been doing for all their other games, and they were going to do this with The Wolf Among Us 2, where they would release the next episode the next week or something like that. The problem with this model is that everybody working at Telltale was always exhausted and always working on the next thing. Personally, I think that Season 1 Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us were peak. This was a studio that had made its name telling intimate human stories, but now they were turning themselves into a content factory, and The Wolf Among Us 2, unfortunately, became one more casualty of a company that promised far more games than it could sustainably build. First version of The Wolf Among Us 2 goes down with the original company that was Telltale, but less than a year later, a company called LCG Entertainment acquired the Telltale name and began rebuilding Telltale around what it had purchased. Now, even though The Walking Dead went back to Skybound and Stranger Things went back to Netflix, the new Telltale secured the rights to properties including Batman and The Wolf Among Us. December 12, 2019, at the Game Awards, Bigby's voice announces the return of The Wolf Among Us 2. In order to make it, the new Telltale partnered with Ad Hoc Studio, a company founded by its former original Telltale developers. Ad Hoc would lead the writing and cinematic direction, while Telltale handled the gameplay, design, and technology. Sounds great, right? Harrington and Yvette also would return as Bigby and Snow. And also, they weren't going to use anything from the cancelled 2017 version of The Wolf 2, meaning that this sequel would start completely from scratch. New story, new production, and all 5 episodes of the season built at once. Now, I like this idea. I prefer releasing the entire season all together because, one, I don't like having to wait till next week to play or see what happens next in the game, but also the new company was hoping to avoid the frantic cycle that had helped to burn its predecessor down. But then things started to go sideways. Wolf 2 was announced in 2019, but after that, it was radio silence and fans wanted to know what was going on. So, December 2020, an update reassured everybody that things were going smoothly, but that they just needed more time. Now, it makes sense because the world kind of stopped during that year, but it wouldn't be until 2022 where Telltale would do a live stream and show a trailer with interviews and behind-the-scenes footage. Now, the trailer ended with a 2023 release window, and it looked like Bigby was finally coming back again. Instead, that trailer became the last look at The Wolf Among Us 2 for more than 4 years, and by the time Telltale properly showed the game again, most of what we had seen belonged to a version that no longer existed. So, Ad Hoc and Telltale were working together for about 2 2 years, and during that period, Ad Hoc wrote a complete script for the season that ran about 800 pages, and they began to shoot cinematic scenes. But then this is where the technology becomes an issue, because The Wolf 2 was being built in Unreal Engine 4. However, Telltale had some custom tools, older custom tools, on top of that, and when they were trying to mix those two together, it became way too complicated, it was too slow, and without spending a ton of money and a ton of time, they couldn't finish the scenes at the quality that they wanted to. And as a result, in 2022, they decided that they were going to abandon that production process and rebuild The Wolf Among Us 2 in Unreal Engine 5. Now, the problem with this is that it meant throwing away years of work and pausing cinematic production for at least another year. This meant Ad Hoc had practically nothing to do in the meantime. The studio had already written the complete season and they began directing its cinematics, but they couldn't do anything until Telltale finished rebuilding the technology behind it. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Ad Hoc, but if you're in this space, you probably recognize the name, especially as of late. At this point in time, when they're still working with Telltale, Ad Hoc is a small indie company. They can't afford to just sit around and do nothing while Telltale gets their stuff together. So what did they end up doing? They moved onto Dispatch. Yeah, amazing game. I have the full story explained, including the comics, over on my main channel. I'll link it down below. But of course, there are two sides to this story of their fallout. Telltale framed the split as a scheduling problem caused by the game's technical reset, while Ad Hoc described a more strained relationship. Later, there were also reports saying that there were creative disagreements and frustrations over how Ad Hoc wasn't able to operate with creative freedom. So Ad Hoc leaves, Telltale hires a different company, Trick Studios, to replace them. Years of work were discarded or rebuilt. This also meant the game that was revealed in 2022 was going to be a very different game. Some earlier ideas may survive, but the scope, cinematics, production team, the creative leadership all changed after Ad Hoc left. In other words, this version of The Wolf Among Us 2 was killed. In March of 2023, Telltale officially pushed The Wolf Among Us 2 release date even beyond that year. 6 months after that, this new Telltale suffered layoffs of its own. The company attributed cuts to market conditions, and as a result, entire teams had to be let go. After that, meaningful updates for The Wolf Among Us 2 dwindled to basically nothing. However, 3 years later, Summer Game Fest, June 2026, Telltale finally returns with a new trailer and a 2027 release window. This is the real thing, and fans could see it was actually here. The sequel still takes place 6 months after the original, with Bigby investigating a series of killings that widens into a conspiracy threatening Fabletown, but the new creative direction leans harder into this idea of Bigby losing control of the beast inside of him. But it gets even crazier than that, because apparently the killer can now trigger the wolf's transformation remotely, turning the most dangerous weapon in Fabletown into a vulnerability that somebody else can exploit whenever they decide. Now, personally, I like this idea. I don't think, or at least off the top of my head, I don't think that I've seen too many games explore this type of dynamic, so I am interested to see how Wolf and Snow handle this. The season is still structured as 5 episodes, but the current plan, thank God, is to release them all together as one complete game instead of making players wait between chapters. Another thing, this was something that I actually asked in my story explained video for The Wolf Among Us, and Telltale actually answered this. When asked whether specific choices from the original game are going to carry forward into the second game, they said maybe, so we'll see. They also announced The Wolf Among Us Remastered for holiday of this year, 2026. The new version would give the original 5 episodes improved lighting, updated animations, refined environments, modern presentation, and archival material including commentary, interviews, concept art, and restored content. Now I'm interested to see what that is. What is the restored content? 11 years, guys, and all that's left now is to see, when this game finally releases, was the return of the big bad wolf worth the wait? All I know is that I love The Wolf Among Us, but not as much as I love my wife.